guests. My name is Allum. I am with the Third Sector Research Centre at the University of Birmingham, United Kingdom, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you today about the impact measurement of volunteering. The starting point when looking at this issue is to ask three questions. Who wants to know about impact? Because different stakeholders have different interests. Why do they want to know? Because different stakeholders are interested in different things. And what happens when it's found out? Outcomes may be used for different purposes: learning, accountability, or they might simply be filed in a cupboard. The impact of volunteering looks at three different areas. We look at who volunteers, we look at the impact on volunteers, and we look at the contribution of volunteering to society. So focusing on the first of those, on who volunteers, it's important that organisations make conscious decisions about who volunteers, because this can clearly affect the outcomes for both the volunteers and for social value. Consider the impact on volunteers themselves of the volunteer experience. It's also important to consider the characteristics of volunteers to make sure that you're not drawing on certain sections of society rather than others, and also to ensure that there's an appropriate power relationship between communities and the volunteers themselves. So, some ways you can measure the impact of volunteer programs to see if you are achieving your targets on diversity and inclusion. Questions to pose to yourself are: do you have systems that enable the volunteering, of the monitoring of volunteers, where they do it, and what they do? And there's a range of different things that you might need to consider. What characteristics are important? Do you have good systems? What do you want to do? What ways do you want the profile to change? And ensure you monitor the changes and review accordingly. Moving on to the second question, the understanding the impact on volunteers. We need to consider why we're interested in this question and the methodology that's appropriate to do it. Methodology may include both this question of the scale and the approach, and may look at subjective and objective approaches. When we're looking at measuring the impact on volunteers, we may well have different objectives. We may be looking at how volunteers self-reflect and learn and improve their life chances. The methods we might use could be individual, group discussions, action planning, mentoring. We might be looking at the kind of progression and decisions of volunteers, and the outcomes, the impact, will be the judgment around how the volunteer progresses personally and professionally over the time with the program. A second way of looking at this might be understanding what volunteers do during and after volunteering. This might be better suited to surveys, possibly interviews, maybe annually. You might answer a range of questions, but depending on what your interest in terms of what volunteers go on and do, for example, occupations, engagement in civil society. And this might inform decisions on program change and addresses accountability issues. Donors may well be interested in what happens to volunteers when they leave programs. Now, the third area, I think, is the one of most interest to many of you, which is addressing the impact of volunteering on social problems and challenges. So, two questions here to look at: what outcomes are of interest? And this is not a straightforward issue, because some may be more interesting to measure than others. So let's have a look at an example of fitting volunteers into target frameworks. Probably the most universal target framework rating are the Sustainable Development Goals. And many organizations have ambition that their work will contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. These set out high-level aspirational goals within which more detailed objectives can be set. Tiers can be located, set, organizational, group, individual level, alongside the tools to assess achievement through a monitoring and evaluation process against targets. So external targets can be measured. For example, the changes in the level of girls progressing to higher education, or changes in birth mortality rates. Now that is quite a structured approach, and there are certain questions that it doesn't quite answer. One of them is the question of attribution, and how do we ascertain the contribution of volunteers? Volunteers don't operate in a vacuum. They work alongside other people, other communities, activities, events that are taking place. The most obvious example has been the impact of COVID. So how do we address the attribution of contribution to volunteers as against the impact of the pandemic? These are not straightforward questions. Various methodologies can help us. One is the tried and trusted method of control groups, where we compare situations where volunteers operate with situations where they don't. But there are problems with that methodology. The second possibility is to look at probability, that we make a judgment about whether or not it's the volunteers that have made the contribution or not. A third way is to look at baselines and review, which is a little bit like the approach I suggested on the Sustainable Development Goals, where we do a baseline survey over a period of time, and then we look at to review what's happened, and then we see how it's changed against the baseline. So these are different ways we might do it. Now, all of these ways require resources, and organizations may not have the resources to undertake this level of monitoring and evaluation. There are financial questions, there are people questions. And do we have the staff that are interested and prepared to engage in this? Do we have the volunteers that would engage in it? Do we have the primary actors, the communities, and the people we work with who wish to engage with it? And do we have the expertise? So there's a lot of resource questions that has to be addressed. One way of looking at the contribution of volunteering is to look at its distinctive contribution. And the UNV SWVR report, State of the World Volunteering Report, recently published, does indicate areas where social value can be seen in distinctive contributions of volunteering. And this builds upon an idea that volunteers have most impact in their relationships with others, and that's the distinctive contribution of volunteering itself. So the focus here is on volunteers as bridge builders, on brokers. In the academic journals, this is talked about as social capital, the relational role of volunteers in building communities. And this may be working with communities to develop and shape policies, providing a link to civic engagement, innovation, and creativity. So that's another focus that can be looked at. Now, measuring this contribution, this distinctive contribution, and indeed measuring much of what we've talked about so far, often come from quite large-scale projects. The distinctive contribution work has come from very large-scale research projects. But for individual VIOs, this is not necessarily feasible. And we might be looking at examples of ways in which this could be manageable economically and resource terms. And one way is through storytelling approaches, where different stakeholders tell their stories about their experiences of being a volunteer, of their experiences of working with volunteers, and looking at how those stories relate to each other. The importance of triangulation is an academic term which says, well, we look at different people's explanations of different situations and to gain an informed and understanding of what has taken place. Some argue that storytelling fits better with the community development model, since the process can be empowering, whereas sometimes the top-down approach of monitoring and evaluation may essentially be disempowering for those involved, that they don't feel part of it and they experience it as something that's done to them rather than something they own or are involved with. So getting towards the conclusion, what do volunteers do and how do we understand and measure it? That big question. So the measurement processes. There is an important question about who measures and whose data do they look at. Do you use an expert? Do you actually measure as an organization? Do you use an external person? Do you work with the community? Does the community look at this? Do the volunteers look at it? How is it done? Some approaches have used volunteers in the process of monitoring and evaluation and contributing to the writing up of the data. So this process is really important. The voice of the community and the volunteer is important in understanding and having an effective approach to looking at impact. Is the process more important than the outcome? And some say the processes can be very negative experience, or they can be a very positive experience. But that depends on how they are run, how they are managed, and how they are led. And finally, how do we address the unintended consequences of measuring impact? There are things that happen that we have no understanding of happened, and that will come through the journey of measuring and monitoring. So I wanted to turn finally to the measures of social value. Clearly, there are some aspects of social value that can be picked up, such as environmental impact, carbon footprint, all of which address the issues around climate change. So that is one bigger question. But a smaller question, if you like, is looking at the direct activities and finding some way in which we can aggregate and give some sense of approximation of the monetary or the social value of investment. And there's been a lot of interest in social return on investment. And I know that KVA have been looking at this question, have developed kits, and other people have developed kits, not just on this, but on other areas of measurement. Social return on investment is a really interesting idea, but it does require a significant investment itself in the process, and can be, as it were, demands rigorous monitoring and evaluation systems and approaches. And if you're interested in that kind of area, it's really important to study and look at what other people have done and how they've done it before you engage with it. So my final reflection is measuring impact is best seen as a learning journey. Finding out what an organization considers is most important to measure and how this connects to cost effectiveness. The one thing I would say is if you've not engaged in measuring impact is that you will find out during the journey all the things that you need to have done differently. And so it's a case of saying, let's do the best we can in the circumstances, and the next time we can improve and learn from that experience. Thank you for listening. I can be contacted at this address. There are other publications I've produced on this, and these are all listed on the slideshow. Thank you.